Okay, so today we're back into class lectures again, and really we're going to be looking at the late 13th and early 14th century. So the last couple of weeks, we're looking at the late first to early second millennium AD, thinking about what are some of the general ideas of late first to early second millennium AD. Anybody? What were some of the things that we were talking about in the last couple of sort of 2 weeks or so? The plague? Not the plague, yeah. Trade, yeah. Okay, good. Right. Sorry. Yeah. All right, trade. What else? Globalization, yeah. Connection of space, intensity of exchanges. What else?
Gender roles. Gender roles.
Gender roles and how social roles, particularly gender roles, for example, were evolving or changing fairly dramatically based on the nature of economy, society, and its structure. What else? Anybody? Think about Genji Monogatari. Think about, like the text that we read, like the problem with women. Think about all the trade goods that we were looking at, shipping lines, and so on and so forth. What other things were we thinking about in the late first and early second millennium AD? Infrastructure, road building, bridge building, even shipbuilding, for example. I mean, these are things that connect spaces and people. Yep. So you would have it. Yes, right.
The various kingdoms that exist in what we now understand as one single unified state, like Korea had like 3 kingdoms and Japan and stuff. But now it's hard to think of a sense we think of it as one single entity.
So we had several different, like fairly substantial kingdoms or states, and societies were fairly large, even though compared to today, they may be in sort of various forms, right? But they're large, but not substantial enough to be completely self-sufficient, I think. And so there was a codependency between different states because of their economic needs and so on and so forth. What else?
The role of like religion.
Buddha. Fine. So religion is a critical element in terms of social and political discourse. And these religions are trans-regional. They're not just confined to one particular society like China, for example, right? Or Japan or Korea, but these are religions that cross substantial spaces and across different cultures, okay? And utilized in various ways to articulate political legitimacy, or, strung up like a piñata and beaten up, right? For political legitimacy. Either way, the point is religion is utilized and exploited, right? For the purpose of consolidation of state and society. Maybe one more. Anyone? Yeah.
Let's say the daily lives of the aristocracy. The men and how they would go to like a special place at night where they would have a bunch of women and drinks and music.
Yeah. So material consumption, the feeding of the flesh, however you want to call it, becomes highly sophisticated because of the level of wealth that people had in this period of time, right? And the level of wealth is tied to the nature of the global climate, which was warming up during a 600-year phase from the 7th century onwards, which allowed for a much larger agricultural output, therefore larger population base, larger economic base, and so the amount of wealth literally just sort of exploded. Right? What else? Maybe one more.
A lot about the trade routes between Japan, Korea, and China, and then also the trade routes going through all over the place, just everywhere. So globalization, but just I was just hinting at like the Silk Road and stuff.
Yeah. So globalization, not only in terms of ideas, or even just the transference of people or the exchange of people, but also economic globalization. So the connection of trade routes, thinking about some of the nature of the trade goods, and so globalization that includes economic globalization as well. Okay. So these are sort of some of the key themes, all right? Thinking about the expansion of the state, the establishment of the bureaucracy as a fixture, right, of society, and how that expanded during this period of time. All of that wonderful, okay, until you get to about the middle and the late 13th century, okay? And that's where it kind of substantially shifts for the next sort of like 500 years or 400 years. Okay, so that trajectory of growth, the trajectory of sort of, increasing wealth, developing sort of material cultural sophistication, economic codependency between different kingdoms and regions around the old world, all the trade, all the logistics that were built up and all that sort of thing, all of that was well and good until the late 13th century. Okay, And usually when we think of the 13th and 14th century, we always think in East Asia particularly, but if we think of Asia as a whole, Mongols come up, right? Okay, this is the period of like the Mongol Khanate, okay? Pax Mongolica, whatever the name you want to call it. The main thing being that the Mongols were the key factor in sort of, lighting up the candle that they, and then all these changes occurred that ushered in the early modern period, okay? Now, to some extent, that is true. But it's also important for us to bear in mind that the Mongols have been around for like millennia, okay, in Central Asia. So the question then really becomes, what were the conditions that resulted in them actually being able to rise the way they did in the late 13th century, right? When they weren't able to do so before that, and they weren't able to do so after that. Okay, so there are a couple of really interesting things that happened at the late 13th century that were critically important for this period of time that led to the ascendancy of the Mongols. Okay, and so that's what we're going to think about today. All right, so today is just a one lecture thing, looking at that sort of point where the point of inflection where the late first, early second millennium kind of boom time of globalization sort of comes to an abrupt end. Okay, and then we have this other phase, which is in historical terms we call it the early modern period, but really what it is it's sort of kind of a global decline. Okay, and so today's class really is just to sort of trying to understand or illuminate this sort of inflection point in history in the late 13th century. Okay, so the state of affairs in East Asia by the late 13th century, as we talked about, all those things that we mentioned, all really wonderful developments, right? But then what ends up happening by the end of the 13th century is that you get an emergence of an interestingly new or different regional trajectory, okay? And the trajectory sets the path for the rest of the early modern into the late modern era, and even to some extent up to today. So some of the things that we see today of East Asia and the rest of Asia and the world really sort of has its beginnings in the late 13th century. So that's one, okay? The other thing, there are a couple of other things that are quite apparent by the late 13th century is that one, East Asia starts to bifurcate. So up until about the middle of the first millennium AD, remember back in the primordial period of this semester, we were talking about how China, or the China landmass, and the Korean Peninsula and Japan were kind of developing very differently through the Neolithic period into the early historic period, right? And then somewhere around about the middle of the first millennium AD, they start to converge together, okay, as a trans-regional sort of glob. Both the Korean Peninsula, China, as well as the Japanese archipelago begin to share a substantial amount of characteristics, including things like the usage of the Chinese written script, okay, to express your own local language, the use of copper coinage, for example, the growth of the bureaucracy. I mean, the list goes on, right? At the end of the 13th century, what we begin to see is the breaking up of East Asia, okay, where China and Korea and the Korean Peninsula continue to develop together in somewhat of a tendon relationship, whereas the Japanese archipelago begins to break away from East Asia. Okay, and its beginnings of the breaking away, the bifurcation begins at the late 13th century. So that's one, okay? A couple of major historical precedents are established in the late 13th century that continue to be manifest today in East Asian geopolitics, okay? And the third one being the historical precedents for some of the nature of international relations in East Asia may be seen in the late 13th century as well as the beginnings of some of these things. So as a period, it may be very short, but in terms of the impact of this period, I think they are quite significant because they set up a whole chain of reactions that then sort of affect East Asian history for the next sort of 700 years or so, okay? The biggest one of which, of course, is if nothing, like none of the context has changed, you will probably not see these sorts of major significant shifts. What does happen is that by the late 13th century, one of the most important things that occur in global history is a series of climate change events. Okay,
So if you think about climate change today and, all the rhetoric and all the so-called scientific data that seems to demonstrate that, like this climate shift is a major phenomenon that's going to affect humankind globally, right? All sorts of historical trajectories are going to shift as a result of that. The 13th century actually went through something of that nature. Firstly, atmospheric temperatures that have been slowly warming over a 600-year period precipitously declines and actually goes into a global cooling period by the end of the 13th century. It's quite dramatic. Within about 30 years, the temperature just like plunges like nobody's business, okay? And ushers in what is known as the mini ice age. This global atmospheric cooling, which really primarily affected the northern hemisphere, the lands of the northern hemisphere. And so we don't really have any data on North American continent, but we do have a lot of data on Asia and Europe right now, okay? What it's so dramatic that what happens by the 17th century is that the Thames, the River Thames in London, freezes over in winter. That's how dramatic the decline is, okay? So the Thames has never been known to freeze, starts to freeze by about the 17th century, okay? So from a really warm sort of global climate down to, such a really cool climate over what is effectively something like a 200-300 year process is pretty dramatic, okay? So we're seeing that, one. There are two major global climate or temperature systems in the world. Does anybody study like earth sciences, like climate science? Okay, so hopefully this will help because I think it's quite complex, but essentially you have two factors that can affect global climate or weather temperatures, right? Like the temperature of the air on land. One is the atmospheric temperature that affects the land, which is up in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so that's one. The second one is the oceanic system, all right, which there is still no consensus as to how the oceans heat up or cool down, although they suspect that a lot of the solar radiation from the sun is one of the most important factors that cause that to happen, okay? So there's no consensus as to what the factor is, but there is the notion that the sun has a huge amount to play, right? Solar radiation on that, okay? So along with the cooling of the atmospheric temperature in the northern hemisphere is the warming of the Pacific Ocean during this period of time. So whereas you had almost 400 years of La Nina effect consistently, like kind of almost year on year, by the 14th century, that swung to the other side where we would see very frequent occurrences of El Nino, okay, in the Pacific Ocean. All right, I'll explain a little bit of that to you in a bit, but the sum total of both effects is that there were changes in the annual rainfall pattern, okay, over Asia and the northern hemisphere for the next 300 years, where you see certain places that used to get quite a lot of rainfall, right, in very warm summers and long summers, suddenly had the length of their summer season shortened, and not only that, but the amount of rainfall reduced as well. Okay, so if you can imagine that happening in agrarian societies, what you will effectively have is the collapse of society. Okay, so this is actually the period of time where places like in Cambodia, in China, India, I mean, the whole place is up in political upheaval. One of the most important historians who used to work in University of Michigan actually kind of like put all of these histories together for a world history textbook. And out of the project, he was like, wait a minute, why are all these kingdoms collapsing, right, at the end of the 13th and 14th century? And that's what actually initiated a huge project that operated out of the University of Michigan and Columbia University, where they were trying to figure out what is the cause of what is effectively a synchronized decline, right, of classical kingdoms. And that led to a huge amount of earth science research projects. And the effect is, the outcome is this explanation that we've actually given. So it's a pretty interesting thing, okay? Where you see the decline of agricultural output, decline of populations as a result of that, and then of course the impact on sea travel because of the changes in the wind pattern, timings, storms, and all sorts of things like that. Essentially, it was a major disruption of the world as we understood it at that time. Okay, and it had a major impact on East Asia. So when we think about global cooling, This is interesting. This is the most sort of easily sort of understood illustration of the change in the atmospheric pattern, right? So where we have this nice warm phase, okay, over several centuries, and then somewhere around about the middle of the 13th century, the 14th, starting the end of the 13th, but really pretty much here, you see this huge decline in the weather, okay? And so what it means is that in the northern hemisphere, the air is becoming cooler and cooler and cooler, okay? When the air gets cooler and your summer seasons are shorter, one major thing happens, okay? So there's hot air here, there's hot air here, okay? And they converge around what is somewhat like the equator, okay? So this band here is known as the intertropical convergence zone, where the northern hemisphere air is kind of swirling down this way, and the southern hemisphere air is kind of swirling up towards the center point, which is like the equator, right? Now in summer, if you have a warm summer, this line starts moving up towards what? The north. Okay, because warm air, what happens to warm air? Right, so warm air rises, cold air sort of pushes it in, right? And so in summer, this line actually, or this band, this zone, tends to move northwards. And depending on how warm it is in the northern hemisphere, the warmer it is, the further it goes. What is important about this band is that this is where a lot of the moisture clouds would sort of swirl. And so what happens is there will be a lot of what? A lot of rain coming down, okay? And so for about 600 years from 780 until about the 13th century, okay? This band in summer was moving quite hard because the weather was what? Warm, right? Up in the north, okay? And so along with the warmth in summer was this band that was bringing in a huge amount of what? Rain moisture, okay? By the late 13th century, all of that changed. And as the northern hemisphere began to cool down, what happens to this band? It stops coming up as far north as it used to be, okay? To the extent that by about the 15th and 16th centuries, this band does not move any higher than about 20 degrees north of the equator. So that's quite low. What it means is that all the summer rains that typically would go to places like what? The subtropical belt of China, the northern half of Southeast Asia, even places like North China, right? The North Chinese plains, the Korean peninsula, they used to get water from this because it was warm in summer, no longer was receiving the summer rains that they used to get, okay? And so this major source of moisture in those lands declined dramatically. And because of that, the output of the agricultural base would decline, right? Along with that is because it's cool, which means your growing season is now also what? Not only is it dry, but you also have what? Shorter summers, okay? So the result is that your agrarian output is what? Significantly reduced, okay? It's not only in China, this affects places like South India as well, certain parts of mainland Southeast Asia. The Middle East suffers dramatically from this drought period. If you think about it, the Abbasid dynasty that started in 750 AD, right, collapses in 1258. When is that? Roughly about this point in time, okay? So there are some major significant political implications for this kind of a climate shift, okay? So here's just just another map just to illustrate the extent of the band, right? In summer where if it's warm enough, we can push as high as the Korean Peninsula, okay? Now, the other thing that's very important is this. As the band pushes up in Central Asia, one of the things that it does is it creates a buffer against the wind that is blowing what? In from the North Atlantic Ocean, okay? And so the wind goes this way, and because the band is on this side, notice the arrows, the wind skirts up towards the what? The Arctic Circle and goes over into what is effectively the Arctic Circle of the Pacific Ocean. And this whole part, which is what Central Asia, remains dry throughout summer. Okay, that's our experience today. Okay, because the weather for the last 200 years has been extremely warm. Okay, in summer. Okay, all right. But in this period that we're thinking about, because this land in summer is relatively what? Cool. this band from the 13th century onwards in summer was actually relatively low. And what it did as a result of that is that it didn't create a buffer in Central Asia where the winds that were coming in from the North Atlantic Ocean were able to sort of bounce off and go up north across the Arctic Circle. And the result was that the winds from the North Atlantic Sea were cutting into places like the north part of Europe and into Central Asia. Okay, so what's happening here is that in summer, the higher latitude countries, places like France and Belgium, like what is today Belgium, right, Finland, and all that sort of places, from the late 13th century was not only getting more rainfall in summer because the intertropical zone was not high enough to push the air into the northern into the Arctic. So they're getting more moisture in summer. And summer is also colder. In winter, they started to have massive freezing as well. Okay. In Central Asia, you had the same thing as well. So there was more moisture in Central Asia, which historically we would think of as a desert area, right? So from this period onwards, was receiving more rainfall in summer, even though winter was relatively colder. Okay, but it was definitely wetter in summer. So the result is that places that used to be deserts like Central Asia, in the period that we were looking at where everybody else was prospering, they were actually suffering because there was not a lot of water there. Okay, from the late 13th century onwards, you had a bursting of flora in those desert areas in Central Asia. Okay, and the result is that the people who lived in Central Asia began to prosper. You see what I'm trying to say now? So now, who are the Mongols? Where are they from? Yeah.
From Mongolia. So
right. So steppe lands or grasslands in where? Central Asia. And so for like centuries, when everybody was prospering because they had more rainfall and all that sort of thing, right? The Central Asian nomadic tribes were trying really hard to eke out a living, right? In that global boom period. From the late 13th century onwards, what happens to the Central Asians? While everybody else is suffering from the lack of rain, right? And cooler summers and shorter summer periods, they were in fact benefiting from the increased rainfall, right? And so their population in Central Asia actually began to increase, okay? And so the result was that you get this interesting confluence of impact on human society, okay? The weakening of traditional states because of famine and a shorter growing season, less moisture, right? And then a concurrent increase in the wealth and population size of Central Asian nomadic tribes, okay? And so what happens at the end of the 13th century is that you get people like the Mongolians being able to emerge, okay, as powerful power brokers in global history, right? Does that make sense? All right, so it's a kind of very long-winded way of explaining why the Mongols rose, right? But the key thing is that the weather had the largest impact on that shift, okay, in global geopolitics. This is just a composite map of the occurrence of El Nino and La Nina. So La Nina just basically means there's more rain. Okay, I'll show you two maps in a bit. But the period where we were looking at classical growth was the La Nina, high frequency period. Okay, and then from the 13th century onwards is effectively the El Nino high frequency period. Okay, and for thinking about the region that we're looking at here, which is East Asia, La Nina actually is really beneficial because it brings what we call winter rain into the tropical and subtropical zones of East Asia. Okay, so between December and March, if you have a La Nina period that year, which means that the oceanic surface of the Pacific Ocean is cooler than it normally would be, okay, then there'll be plenty of rainfall at the end of the year and the beginning of the year for places like Southeast Asia, all the way up till like Okinawa, for example, the Japanese archipelago, and then definitely the subtropical and central parts of China, like particularly the coast, right? But if you have a El Nino year, okay, which means that the Pacific Ocean surface is much warmer than it usually is, then what ends up happening is the movement of water actually goes in the opposite direction. And the result is that the rain clouds are unable to precipitate across the Pacific. And so because of that, there is no rainfall in December to March. Okay, so this is just like an additional add-on. If you think about East Asia, so if we were studying Indian history, for example, this wouldn't be an issue at all, okay? Right? But because we're studying East Asian history, this is actually a massive factor. So not only are your summers drier, now even your winter rainfall is also what? Reduced, okay, as a result of that. So that's like a double whammy, basically, okay? So all of that means plants are struggling to grow where they traditionally would be growing. In Europe, agriculture collapses, people are dying, they're starving, they're getting cold, right? Everybody's having some of the accounts of Europeans in Switzerland, the lower slopes of Switzerland, they had to abandon the villages that were up on the higher slopes that they had been, establishing for the last 500 years. They had to come down from the mountain slopes and hide down in the lower valleys of the Alps. Okay, so that was one. Number two, accounts were that there was so little food in places like Switzerland at the time that people, not only they died, but those who survived would be sleeping for 60 days. So they literally, you had humans hibernating over winter because one, there was no food. And number two, men would sleep together without clothes on because that was the only way they could keep warm. So, do you see, can you see a picture there? Okay, and the picture is essentially the breakdown of what we call a reproductive family unit, okay? Because men were huddled together, women were huddled together, 60 days, at the end of which you don't know how many people would survive, okay? Incidentally, if you think about early American history, right, the earliest settlers and how many people died over winters, okay, it coincides with the peak of this period of time as well, okay? So just saying, okay? And so you get a decline of traditional agrarian states, but the rise of interstate states, right? So in between states in places like Central Asia, for example, okay? Major efflorescence of civilization over here. The best art production in Central Asian kingdoms through millennia occurred during this period of time, okay? Because they just were so well to do, okay? And not only were they growing more, feeding more, but also they became somewhat of the power brokers, basically, in global history, okay? And so this bottom half, I'm not going to talk about. This is, if you take like History 100 with me, we'll go into some length in that regard, but doesn't really quite concern it. So who are the Mongols? So they're just Central Asian, tribe, nomadic people, right, in the steppes of Mongolia. Okay, very well known for their animal pastoral activity, sheep, lamb, herd, goats, yaks. Been around for a really long time, okay? Chinese historical documents talk about them from like literally the first millennium BC. They've been kind of on the north, irritating the settled agriculturalists of the North Chinese plains, okay? And so there's a long history of encroachment into North China. Whenever they needed any resources, they would kind of ride on their ponies down south, and sort of rampage around, take whatever they could, okay? And so it's known through Chinese history that these guys have existed, okay? So from the second and first millennium century BC onwards, by various names, different kinds of tribes and all that, but effectively the same kind of like tribal people in Central Asia, okay? And so that's that long history. The Mongols came in the 13th and 14th century and were really effective because they were the first Mongolian steppe-land people to, number one, be able to control both the east and west central parts of Central Asia. So in other words, the whole of their central chunk that always served as a geographical barrier because it was a desert, right? This is the first time in history, right, that barrier no longer existed. So that's one, okay? Number two, it was the first time in East Asian history that a steppe land or Central Asian tribal group were able to control all of China and the Korean Peninsula. Never before and never again, okay? The closest to that was the Qing dynasty from 1644. Okay, but I think the reason for that was because the Mongols had established a precedence already, right, along which they could follow, okay? So these were the two significant impacts on East Asia because of the Mongol period. So here's a chronological list of, the expansion across the whole of the old world. I'm not going to go through it. This is on BB Learn, so you can have a look at it in greater detail later on, but just visually, this is what they look, okay? Okay,
Oh, wow.
yeah, okay, within like what? How many years is this? Yeah, so maps have a way of exaggerating achievement, but I mean, nonetheless, it actually is pretty, phenomenal. Yeah, okay. And so the whole of continental Asia is split up into like sort of 4 major khanates, right? 4 different sort of like royal lineages, but all tied to the one Mongolian extended family that's under Temujin. Okay. By the end of the 13th century, this is basically the political map. So for East Asia, these were the major significant sort of like military events, right? By about 1230, 80, the Mongols have captured most of the North Chinese territories. If you kind of cut a line across China in the middle, that's roughly where the Huai River is. Okay, the course of the Huai River. By 250, they are into the southwest part of China. They've conquered Sichuan and Yunnan, which gives them access to places like Myanmar, Burma, okay, mainland Southeast Asia, the list goes on. And then by 1279, they basically, all of the coastal ports of China capitulate to Mongol invasion, and they declare what is known as the Mongol rule over all of China, right? 1279, okay? In Korea, interestingly, before they capture all of China, the Mongols are invading the Korean peninsula, okay? And so it's always across Central Asia, okay? 1231, they invade the Korean peninsula. By 1255, Goryeo, which is a kingdom, right, in the Korean peninsula, the only one left at this juncture, signs a treaty with the Mongols, basically submitting to their suzerainty, so it becomes a vassal state, okay? Pays an annual tribute, basically. But Japan, the Mongols find all these ships along the coastline of China and go like, let's get on there and let's go over to Japan and try to conquer the place, right? And they tried it twice, one in the 70s and one in the 1280s, both failed, okay? And the reason why they both failed was because this was a period of time where the climate was what? Shifting. And so the Mongols are trying to sail at a time when the typhoons were the most ferocious for like a several number of decades, okay, because of the nature of the climate, okay? And so the ships keep getting smashed up before they arrive at the Japanese archipelago. The typhoons are basically destroying the vessels. Anyone that makes it to the Japanese archipelago is massacred by all the Japanese people there. And of course, there are a couple of painting scenes that depict this, particularly, I think, the 1281 military campaign, where the Japanese are literally going in small little boats, right, and swarming the remaining or surviving Mongol fleet that made it past the typhoons, right, and then basically killing everybody. And so on both occasions, massive military campaign, but both ended up in what? Absolute abject failure, okay? But the impact of the Mongolian expeditions to the Japanese archipelago were quite phenomenal. And one of which was, of course, prior to this point in time, the Japanese kingdoms were in economic exchange and diplomatic exchange with the Korean Peninsula kingdoms and China, right? Once this happens at the end of the 13th century, the Japanese decide to close their doors. They're not going to interact with anybody outside anymore. Okay, and so what ends up happening is the bifurcation, right? You shut your doors and you become isolated from everything else that's going on the mainland, including the Korean Peninsula in China. Okay, so it had a pretty fundamental impact on Japanese society. Okay, so in terms of like some of the major disruptions in East Asia, one of which would be territorial administration, right? The Mongols are really a very small group of people. And the reason why they expanded so rapidly was because militarily they were highly capable, but they were really not interested in administrating territory. They were more interested in just getting land, getting resources. And so it was kind of like a fief mentality where you would live off people and the land. Okay. And so that was how they looked at it, right? And it was really incongruent with the notion of administrative structures and bureaucracies that East Asian societies had already developed by this point. Right? And so what it was you would have the bureaucracy still in place, and then this small little layer at the top, which were the Mongols, and all they did was just kind of literally just lift off everything else that was going on. Okay, so it's a dual administrative system compared to a singular bureaucratic system that had been developing for hundreds of years in East Asia. Okay, so it's the first time that's happening, and they do it to great effect. Okay, in terms of diplomacy, again, wasn't so much that they were interested in prestige, or like state level interactions and relationships, but really more for the products that were coming in from these foreign regions that they could enjoy. So the whole notion of material consumption and largesse from international relations became basically the basis upon which diplomacy was conducted by the Mongols. Okay, and so because of that, it disrupted the trans-regional economic frameworks that were developed over the last couple of centuries. Okay, and the third very important thing that occurred with the Mongol incursion was that culturally there were new things that were introduced. So up to this juncture, Buddhism was really primarily the main sort of foreign import in terms of culture in East Asia that had a deep impact. But with the Mongols came two interesting things. One was Islam. Okay, so we always think of Islam coming in from the sea, the Middle Easterners coming in ships, the Chinese ports and all that, and that was part of it. But Islam really makes its headway into China through Central Asia by way of the Mongols during this time, right? So if we think of Chinese political history today, like social history today, and we think of lately in the news, there's a lot of discussion about the Xinjiang autonomous region in China, where there are a lot of Muslims, right, being persecuted by the Chinese state and all that. Xinjiang autonomous region is basically where places like Dunhuang Caves is located, right? So it's kind of out in the northwest facing Central Asia, all right? That whole Islamic influence really only came about in this period of time because of Mongol incursion. So it introduced Islam into general society, right, in certain parts of China, okay, where the Mongols had a substantial foothold. So one, Xinjiang autonomous region today, northwest China will be one. The other part would be in places like Sichuan and Yunnan. There were large bodies of Muslim populations there because the Mongols were there from the 1250s and trying to establish themselves. Okay, and so what then ended up happening is culturally China is then further carved into several different large regions from a cultural religious point of view. Yunnan and Sichuan would be one where there are substantial Muslims, like even up to today, by the way. Okay, and then Xinjiang in the northwest, okay, would be another one. And then Sichuan will be here if you think of the China map. And then the rest of China, let me see if I can get a map. Okay, so southwest Yunnan, Sichuan here will be where Islam becomes very powerful in the 14th century. Okay, the other part will be around here, right, where Dunhuang and all those other places are located. Think of your map quiz, okay, which today is the Xinjiang autonomous region. Okay, so China is broken up culturally by the 14th century into what? More parts, right, where Islam becomes important in these areas. And the really sort of traditional Chinese cultures and religions remain pretty much where in this area here. Okay, so that's actually a substantial and fundamental and significant development as a result of the Mongol incursion into East Asia. Administratively, the Mongols were about 2-3 million people at that time. All of them became, because they're all tied together in some kind of tribal family relationship, okay, they all became essentially the highest levels of hierarchy in the Mongol kingdom, okay? So by 1279, all of China is under Mongol rule, only lasts for about 80 years. But during that time, Mongols were right at the top of the social hierarchy, okay? And then under them were other Central Asian tribes, because Central Asia has a lot of different tribes, but they had some kind of kinship. If you think about, I don't want to use the word primitive, but if you think about tribal or primitive societies, you have you have these concentric circles of relationships, right? The closest are the ones where you have your blood ties or familial relationships, like we all come from the same womb, for example, or we have the same father, right? And then next to that is we are in the same village. We may not come from the same womb or the same father, but we are in the same village. And then further apart, we have a lot of historical relationships where, maybe 20 years ago, right? My uncle, 2 times removed, got a bride from your village, right? You see what I'm trying to say, okay? And then it just goes on and on, okay? So the interesting thing about tribal societies is that those sorts of concentric circles or relationships are critically important. And so just under the Mongols would be these East Asian tribes. And then after that, all other Central Asian people. And then below that, the Muslims and the Nestorian Christians. And then only after that, all other conquered people, okay? So can you imagine if you were Chinese, like me, like 100% Chinese DNA, okay? And let's say I lived in the time of the Mongol Empire in China. And imagine that I came from, the National Academy, I got a PhD, right? I got my degree from, the national exam, right? Board, okay? So yesterday, the Song Dynasty was around. I was a somewhat important official, right? Okay, I had a stipend from the state. I was pretty well to do. I had a nightlife, things like that. And then the Mongols take over, and then this social hierarchy occurs. Okay, so what it creates is a substantial displacement of society, number one. Number two, the notion of social hierarchy that is upended and turned upside down, right, creates this whole thing where you're like, I'm not happy with what's going on. Okay, but because this is my livelihood, I end up having to do what I have to do anyway, right? Remember, the bureaucracy is still what in place. The Mongols are just occupying the top level, okay, and sort of sucking everything up from there, right? But the social structure and the political structure is still intact. But the problem is, Mongols are where? They're not only in China, they're also in Korean Peninsula, so you can't run away to there, right? They are invading Indonesia, for crying out loud, right? They're trying to get this naval thing ready to go over to the Japanese. You see what I'm trying to say? Okay, and they're already occupying the rest of Central Asia. At the end of the 13th century, even in the early 14th century, it's not clear at all that the Mongols are going to go away. Okay, and so what that creates is a substantial amount of displacement. Okay, and so the 14th century is interesting because you start to see substantial people movement, population movements of like Chinese, Koreans, and all that sort of thing, moving out of the places that they have been entrenched in for so long, trying to be refugees, basically, to look for a better life somewhere else, okay? And so Southeast Asia becomes one of those places, right? One of the earliest movements of Chinese diaspora as refugees, right? They were pushed out of somewhere as opposed to they were pulled, right? Attracted to a certain place. Is actually the 14th century. And you see massive numbers of people migrating to Southeast Asia from China during this time. Okay, so that's one. But administratively, the Mongols were really interesting because you have this layer of people here, right? Most of whom they are not Chinese, okay? And so they allowed them to do tax farming so that they can draw the money from the system and enjoy themselves. The Mongols were able to draw the money from the system. And so they established what was known as administrative interlocutors. Okay, so the administrative system is in place, bureaucratic system is in place, but you have a go-between, kind of like a tax collector in the Bible, right? And then they would feed the money upwards to where? Like the Romans, in the case of the Bible, or in this case is the Mongol, okay? And there was a particular class of people that they would utilize, which is these guys here. Because they never trusted these people here, especially the Chinese, right? And so they were called the Darachi, or in Chinese it was called Se Mu Ren, which means Se means color, Mu means eye, Ren just means people. So people with colored eyes. But this is what's happening. They're looking at the irises, right? Because of your ethnic and genetic, right, descent. And if your eyes are black, you fall under this. If your eyes are other sorts of colors, you could technically be what? Yeah, Darachi, okay? And so then you'll be benefiting from the system. See what I'm trying to say? So not only are you a conquered people now if you are Chinese, right, or Korean, but on top of that, you have all these other people piling on top of you as well, right? Okay, so it creates a tremendous sense of resentment. One of the most important genres of writing, like fictional writing in Chinese, because you can't write a memorial to complain about it anymore, you get killed, right? They start to write fiction novels. So one of the most important fiction novels is called the Water Margin, Shui Hu Zhuan. Basically, it's stories of the water margin. It's all these different people, right? Well, all these Chinese, like, and then they were wrong. There's something under the Mongol period, and they would run away into the marsh. Okay, and if you think about it, the U.S. has the equivalent of that. If you think of the Civil War, right? You had African American folk, for example, running away to where the swamplands of, right, the deep south, right? Yeah, right, because the state could not reach there. Okay, the geographical zone. So in that sense, it's the same concept as well. There were novels that were written about the marshland where people who were dispossessed by the Mongol state, right, and the society structure that the Mongols put in place would run away into the marshland, and there they became basically heroes. I mean, they were bandits, but then kind of like your Robin Hood kind of a thing. Okay, so it spurred an interesting genre of writing in Chinese literature, which never existed before. Okay, and that was fiction. Okay, so fiction started during this period of time. Because the Mongol Empire, and I think I only have 1 or 2 slides left after this, so we're almost at the end, guys. Okay, because the Mongols were a singular kind of force across the whole of Central Asia. The result was that for the first time, instead of having sectors of communication operating, right, where the overlapping edges were the ones that communicated across the two regions, okay? This is the first time you had what was known as a trans-global, like a global, okay, system that was going on. Only for about 100 years or so, okay? So if you were a Mongolian official, for example, you were given one of these things, okay? So it's a medallion, right, cast in Mongolian script, but effectively it provided you, basically it's like a passport. You had a pass, the right of passage to go from here all the way to this side or back, right? So you're riding on your horse, and then you reach the way station, you change the horse. It's like a postal system, right? And then you go on and all that sort of thing, okay? Now, what is really amazing about that, obviously, is that this is the first time that it's occurred across the whole of Asia, all right? This is also the first time that pathogens can then be passed from one end to the other end, okay? So guess what happens in the 14th century? There we go, yeah. So if it was the bubonic plague, at the time when it was sectorial trade, there would have been a high likelihood that it would have either the rate of passage of the Black Plague would have been really fairly slow or concentrated in one particular sector, right? But because it coincided with the Mongol period in the 14th century, what then ends up happening is a plague incident occurs. And by the way, plagues are not new in the 14th century. It's happened before, right? Roman Empire and all that sort of thing. But it occurs somewhere, they suspect, okay? They still really don't know, but they suspect it began somewhere in Myanmar, Burma. And in the late 13th, early 14th century, it got spread into Southwest China, brought over into Beijing. All of Beijing is in flames because of the Black Plague. The Mongols retreat, like those who could afford it, right? The Mongols ran away from the capital in Beijing, the summer capital. They ran away into Central Asia to try to get away from the plague. They're still in control of China at this juncture. But what ends up happening is that then the plague catches onto the Silk Road, right? And travels on horseback across the whole of Central Asia, eventually shows up in the Black Sea. And from there, it spreads to the rest of the Middle East because of the trade routes, right? The Middle East, North Africa, and then one beautiful ship that left the seaport in the Black Sea, sails back to Venice. By the time it gets there, all the crew is dead. There are like 3 or 4 sailors left that were still alive. The ship calls at Venice. The customs officials go onto the ship and all these dead bodies. They then ditch the dead bodies in the sea. And so that's when the plague gets introduced into Europe through Venice. So Pax Mongolica is beautiful, but it's also really bad from their perspective. Okay, so 30 to 60% of the population dies. Okay, thanks to this Mongol system that was established, basically. Okay, so just to conclude, question? No? Okay. So was it Mark Twain who said, like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it what? But it definitely echoes. I think that's what he used to say. Yeah. Okay. Really interesting. Okay. Anyway, so the conclusion would be: in Mongol period in East Asia was not very long and short-lived. Right? Why was it important? Number one, right? The modern borders of China and its cultural borders in particular, right, becomes demarcated during this period of time. Right? Continues to exist today. This one. Okay. Number two, because the Korean Peninsula submits and becomes a vassal state of the Mongol kingdom, right, in China, Korea is now again realigned with the administrative orbit of what, China, right? And then instead, Japan becomes what? Isolated. So it's actually from the 14th century onwards that the Tokugawa period becomes, important. They've always had shoguns, they've always had samurais, but this is the period where the Nara, the Heian kingdom collapses, right? It's still around nominally, but the shoguns, like the local fief lords, become basically the major power brokers. And by the 14th century, the Tokugawa shogun and his lineage become the major power brokers in Japan. Okay. The other thing that's really interesting is that Japan then adopts. You don't see that very much before this point in time, but after this point in time onwards, you can actually identify that strong military culture in Japanese society really comes from this point in time, okay, onwards. And that is basically what happened at this point in time. Because prior to this, there was huge amounts of what? Exchanges, okay? So Japan begins to drift out of China and Korea's orbit by this point, and it just becomes increasingly sort of, distant over the next couple of centuries until the US show up and they open their doors, and then you have the Meiji Restoration, the rest of